The November wind cut through Detroit's east side like a knife through paper, carrying with it the smell of rust, rain, and decay. Marcus Hayes pulled his threadbare jacket tighter around his thin frame, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as he navigated the cracked sidewalks of Gratiot Avenue. At 14, he'd learned that survival meant staying invisible, keeping moving, and never, ever trusting adults. The sky hung low and grey, threatening snow that would make the coming nights even more dangerous. Marcus had been on the streets for 3 months now, 92 days since he'd climbed out the bathroom window of his 4th foster home, the Hendersons' place in Warren. He could still hear Mr. Henderson's heavy footsteps outside the locked door, still feel the bruises that had finally convinced him that the streets, however harsh, were safer than that house. "Hey, kid, you buying or moving along?" Marcus didn't need to look up to know it was Ray, the convenience store owner who worked the corner of Gratiot and Connor. He quickened his pace, his worn sneakers, 2 sizes too big, found behind a Goodwill, slapping against the wet pavement. The sole on his left shoe had started to separate, and he'd wrapped it with duct tape twice already this week. The abandoned Packard plant loomed in the distance, a skeleton of Detroit's former glory. Marcus had spent the first 2 weeks there, before the police started doing regular sweeps. Now he rotated between 3 spots: an alcove behind the old Michigan Central Station, a hollowed-out shed near the Eastern Market, and when things got really bad, the service tunnels under Grand Circus Park, though those were controlled by older homeless men who didn't take kindly to teenagers invading their territory. His stomach cramped with hunger. He'd eaten yesterday, half a sandwich he'd found in a trash can behind a Subway, only slightly soggy, but today he'd had nothing. The churches served meals, but they asked questions. They wanted names, ages, parents. They called social services. Marcus had learned that lesson the hard way in September, spending 3 terrifying days back in the system before managing to slip away again. The social worker, Ms. Patterson, had looked at him with something like pity. "Marcus, you're too young to be on your own. The Hendersons told us it was all a misunderstanding. We can work this out." But Marcus had seen Mr. Henderson's face in the meeting room, the warning in his eyes, the fake concern in his voice. He knew what waited for him back there, so he'd run again. As Marcus turned down a side street, heading toward the old Fisher body plant where he'd spotted a dumpster that restaurants sometimes used, he heard it, a sound that made him stop in his tracks. A whimper, low, pained, desperate. He'd learned not to investigate strange sounds. The streets taught you to mind your business, to keep your head down. But something about this particular sound pulled at something deep in his chest, some part of him that remembered what it felt like to hurt and have no one come. The sound came from an alley between 2 abandoned buildings, their windows boarded up with weathered plywood covered in faded graffiti. Marcus hesitated at the entrance, scanning for danger. The alley was narrow, littered with broken glass and old newspapers that shifted in the wind like restless ghosts. There, about 20 feet in, partially hidden behind an overturned dumpster, was a dog. It was medium-sized, maybe 40 pounds, with matted fur that might have been brown or rust-colored under all the dirt and blood. The dog's right front leg was extended at an unnatural angle, clearly injured, and a gash along its ribs oozed dark blood onto the concrete. Its eyes, dark and intelligent despite the pain, locked onto Marcus with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Easy, boy," Marcus whispered, moving slowly into the alley. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog's tail gave a weak thump against the ground, but it didn't try to move. Marcus could see it trembling, whether from cold, pain, or fear, he couldn't tell. Probably all 3. He knew he should walk away. He had nothing to give this animal. He could barely keep himself alive. Getting involved meant complications, meant staying in one place too long, meant using resources he didn't have. But those eyes, God, those eyes looked just like his had in the bathroom mirror at the Hendersons' house, right before he'd decided he'd rather risk death in the cold than spend one more night under that roof. Marcus crouched down, extending his hand slowly. "It's okay. I know it hurts." The dog's nose twitched, sniffing the air. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, it stretched its neck forward and licked Marcus's fingers. The touch was warm, gentle, trusting in a way that made Marcus's throat tighten. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice cracking slightly. "Yeah, I got you. We're gonna figure this out." He looked around the alley, his mind racing. The dog couldn't walk, that much was clear. The injury looked recent. Maybe a car hit, maybe a fight with another animal, maybe kicked by some cruel person who saw a stray as nothing more than a nuisance. Marcus knew that feeling too. The temperature was dropping. The weatherman on the TV in the gas station window had said it would hit the low 20s tonight. Neither of them would survive the night without shelter. Marcus made a decision that he didn't fully understand, driven by something deeper than logic or self-preservation. He carefully slipped off his jacket, his only real protection against the cold, and gently wrapped it around the shivering dog. "Come on, buddy," he said, gathering the animal carefully in his arms, wincing at its yelp of pain. "Let's find somewhere warm." The dog was heavier than he expected, and his arms burned with the effort. But Marcus started walking, heading toward the old industrial district, where fewer people meant fewer questions. He had no plan, no solution, just a bone-deep certainty that leaving this creature to die alone wasn't an option. He didn't know it yet, but this wounded dog was about to change everything. The old Riverside Industrial Complex sprawled across 12 acres of forgotten Detroit, a graveyard of American manufacturing that had been slowly reclaimed by nature and neglect. Marcus had only been here once before, scared off by stories of unstable floors and the occasional security patrol, but it was the closest shelter he could think of, and the dog in his arms was growing heavier with each step. Sweat dripped down Marcus's face despite the cold, soaking through his thin t-shirt. Without his jacket, the wind seemed to cut straight to his bones, but the warmth of the injured dog against his chest provided small comfort. The animal had stopped whimpering, which worried Marcus more than the earlier cries. Either it was slipping into shock, or it trusted him enough to conserve energy. He hoped it was the latter. The fence surrounding the complex had more holes than barriers. Marcus slipped through a gap near the eastern corner, careful not to jostle the dog too much. The main building loomed before them, 6 stories of broken windows and exposed rebar, its brick facade stained with decades of weather and abandonment. "Almost there, boy," Marcus whispered, though he had no idea where there actually was. He circled the building, looking for a ground-level entrance that wouldn't require climbing. His arms screamed with fatigue, and his empty stomach had started to cramp more violently. At the north side, he found what he was looking for, a loading dock with a partially open roll-up door, rusted into position about 3 feet off the ground. Marcus set the dog down gently on the concrete dock, unwrapping his jacket from around the animal's body. The dog's breathing was shallow but steady, its eyes following Marcus's movements with acute awareness. "Stay here 1 second, Marcus said, as if the injured animal could go anywhere. He ducked under the door, pulling out his phone. A battered iPhone 6 he'd found in a parking lot. No service, but the flashlight still worked if he charged it at the library. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a vast open space that had once been a factory floor. The smell hit him immediately, rust, mold, pigeon droppings and something else. That particular scent of abandonment, of a place where humans hadn't set foot in years. His light played across overturned machinery, scattered debris, and a floor that looked structurally sound, at least near the entrance. Marcus returned to the dog and carefully lifted it again, maneuvering them both under the door. Once inside, he carried the animal about 20 feet in, far enough from the entrance to avoid the wind, but close enough to escape if needed. He set the dog down on a relatively clean patch of concrete, then began gathering materials. Years of survival had taught Marcus to work quickly and efficiently. Within 20 minutes, he'd created a makeshift shelter using an old wooden pallet propped against a support column, covered with cardboard sheets he'd found stacked in a corner. It wasn't much, but it would hold their body heat and protect them from drafts. He'd also found something unexpected, a dusty first aid kit mounted on a wall near what used to be a supervisor's office. The metal box was rusted but intact. Inside, most of the supplies were ancient and useless, but there were gauze pads still in sealed plastic, a roll of medical tape that seemed okay, and even a small bottle of hydrogen peroxide that hadn't completely evaporated. Marcus knelt beside the dog, who watched him with those impossibly trusting eyes. "This is gonna hurt," Marcus said softly. "I'm sorry." He'd treated his own wounds plenty of times, scraped knees, cut hands, a particularly nasty gash on his arm from climbing a fence. This wasn't so different, he told himself, ignoring the fact that he had no idea what he was doing with an animal. The dog whimpered as Marcus cleaned the gash along its ribs, but it didn't snap or try to bite. Instead, it licked Marcus's wrist, as if reassuring him that it understood he was trying to help. The gesture made Marcus's eyes burn with unshed tears. "You're a tough one," Marcus whispered, carefully applying gauze and tape. The dog's leg was another matter, clearly broken or badly sprained. Marcus found a sturdy piece of wood and used strips from his own shirt to create a crude splint. It wasn't veterinary medicine, but it was something. By the time he finished, full darkness had fallen outside, and the temperature inside the factory had dropped noticeably. Marcus crawled into the cardboard shelter with the dog, wrapping his jacket around both of them and pulling the animal close. The dog's body heat helped, and for the first time in months, Marcus didn't feel completely alone. "I'm Marcus," he said quietly into the darkness. "I don't know if you understand me, but we're kind of in the same situation, you and me. Nobody wants us. Nobody's looking for us. We're just trying to make it through one more day." The dog shifted slightly, pressing its head against Marcus's chest. Its breathing had evened out, and Marcus could feel its heartbeat steady and strong despite everything. "I had a dog once," Marcus continued, surprising himself. He never talked about before. "When I was 7, before my mum, before things got bad. His name was Charlie. He was this little terrier mix, always barking at everything. Made my mom laugh. The memory hurt, sharp and clear. His mother's smile, the sound of her laugh, the way she'd ruffle Marcus's hair and call him her little man. Then the car accident, the funeral he barely remembered, and the rapid descent into the foster care system, a carousel of temporary homes, each one teaching him that love was conditional and safety was an illusion. "I wonder if Charlie is okay," Marcus whispered. "I wonder if someone took care of him after they took me away." The dog made a small sound, somewhere between a whine and a sigh. "Yeah," Marcus agreed. "I'll take care of you. We'll take care of each other. Deal." As if in answer, the dog's tail thumped weakly against the cardboard floor. Outside, the wind howled through the broken windows of the factory. Inside their small shelter, 2 discarded souls huddled together against the cold, finding in each other something neither had thought they'd find again: companionship. Hope. Marcus closed his eyes, exhausted, hungry, cold, but not entirely alone. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow, he'd figure out how to find food for both of them. Tomorrow, he'd worry about the next step. Tonight, they would survive. Marcus woke to weak sunlight filtering through the broken windows of the factory, his body stiff and aching from sleeping on concrete. For a disorienting moment, he didn't remember where he was. Then he felt the warm weight pressed against his side, and it all came back. The wounded dog, the factory, the desperate effort to create shelter. He sat up carefully, wincing at the protest from his muscles. The dog was awake, watching him with alert eyes that seemed clearer than yesterday. The makeshift bandage on its ribs was still in place, and while the animal clearly couldn't walk properly, it seemed more stable. That was something. "Morning, buddy," Marcus said, his voice hoarse. His stomach felt like it was trying to digest itself, cramping so badly that he had to take several deep breaths. He couldn't remember the last time he'd gone this long without eating. The dog whined and struggled to stand, managing to get up on 3 legs while keeping the injured one elevated. Before Marcus could react, the animal began limping determinedly toward the back of the factory floor, away from the entrance. "Hey, where are you going?" Marcus scrambled to follow, worried the dog would hurt itself further. "You can't walk on that leg!" But the dog was insistent, moving with surprising determination despite the obvious pain. It paused every few feet to look back at Marcus, as if making sure he was following. There was something urgent in its behavior, something that went beyond random wandering. They made their way deeper into the factory, past rusted machinery and piles of debris. The sunlight grew dimmer, and Marcus had to use his phone's flashlight to see clearly. The dog led him to what looked like an old storage area, then stopped in front of a section of floor that looked different from the rest. Newer concrete, maybe, or repaired at some point. The dog sat down awkwardly, favoring its injured leg, and began to paw at the floor with its good front paw. The scratching sound echoed in the empty space. "What is it?" Marcus knelt beside the animal, running his hand over the concrete. There was definitely something different here. He could see faint lines in the concrete, like a seam or a hatch of some kind, covered over with a thin layer of newer material that had cracked and weathered with age. Marcus looked around and spotted a metal rod among the debris. Using it as a pry bar, he worked at the edges of what he now realized was definitely a hatch or door of some kind. The concrete coating was only about an inch thick, more like a concealment than structural material. After 15 minutes of effort that left his arms shaking and his empty stomach churning with nausea, something gave way. A section of floor about 4 feet square shifted, revealing rusted metal underneath with a wheel-style handle, like something from a submarine. "What the hell?" Marcus breathed. The dog barked once, sharp and insistent, then looked at Marcus expectantly. "You want me to open it?" Marcus stared at the hatch, his mind racing. This was Detroit. Old factories like this sometimes had basements, storage areas, even old prohibition tunnels, but this looked different, deliberate, hidden. Against his better judgment, which had been questionable lately anyway, Marcus gripped the wheel and turned. It resisted at first, decades of rust and disuse fighting against him, but something had to give, and finally, with a screech of protesting metal, it did. The hatch opened upward on spring-loaded hinges, revealing a metal ladder descending into darkness. A rush of stale air, but not the terrible smell Marcus had expected. Instead, it was dry, almost sterile, like a sealed space that had been protected from the elements. Marcus shined his light down. The ladder descended about 15 feet to what looked like a metal floor. The walls were concrete, reinforced with steel beams. This wasn't just a basement. "This is insane," Marcus muttered. But the dog was already trying to climb down, struggling with its injured leg. "No, no, no, stop!" Marcus grabbed the animal gently. "You'll hurt yourself more. Here!" He took off his jacket again and fashioned a sling, securing the dog against his chest like a baby. The animal was heavier than comfortable, but manageable. With his phone clenched between his teeth, flashlight pointing downward, Marcus began to descend the ladder. Each rung felt precarious, his legs shaking from hunger and exhaustion. The dog remained surprisingly still, as if it understood the precariousness of their situation. Finally, Marcus's feet touched solid ground. He set the dog down carefully and took stock of their surroundings, sweeping the flashlight in a slow circle. What he saw made his breath catch. They were in a bunker, not a basement, not a storage area, an actual Cold War-era bunker. The space was roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, with metal walls and a low ceiling. Along one wall was a long table with what looked like old communications equipment. Radios, perhaps, or monitoring devices, all covered in dust, but surprisingly intact. Shelving units lined another wall, stocked with supplies. Marcus moved closer, hardly believing what he was seeing. The shelves held canned goods, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Beans, vegetables, soup, fruit. There were also large plastic containers labeled emergency water, military-style rations in sealed packages, blankets still in plastic wrapping, and boxes of various supplies. But what caught his attention most was a desk in the corner, where a faded newspaper lay beside what looked like a journal or ledger. Marcus picked up the newspaper carefully. It was from August 1992. The headline, something about the presidential election. 33 years ago. The journal was more interesting. Marcus opened it carefully, the pages brittle but readable. The first entry was dated July 1985. This facility is now operational as Bunker J7, part of the Civilian Defense Network. In the event of nuclear attack, this location will serve as a coordination point for Detroit sector emergency response. God willing, it will never be needed. Marcus flipped through more pages, maintenance logs, inventory lists, training schedules. Then, near the end, something different. An entry from June 1992. I can't keep silent anymore. What I saw at the Warren chemical plant isn't an industrial accident. The records I've copied prove they've been dumping toxic waste into the water supply for years. I've hidden the evidence here in the ventilation duct behind the eastern wall panel. If something happens to me, someone needs to know the truth. Robert Chen, environmental inspector. Marcus's hands trembled as he held the journal. He looked at the eastern wall, where indeed there was a ventilation panel, slightly ajar. The dog limped over and sat beside him, leaning against his leg. Did you know this was here?" Marcus asked the animal softly. "Is this where you've been hiding?" The bunker was warm, probably something to do with the insulation or the way it was sealed. It was dry, protected, stocked with food and water. It was survival, maybe more than survival. Marcus set the journal down and explored further. In a small side room, he found bunk beds with sealed mattresses, a bathroom with what looked like a composting toilet and a water recycling system, and more supplies. This place had been designed to keep people alive for months, maybe years, and no one knew it existed. The dog barked softly, bringing Marcus's attention back to the present. The animal was looking at him with those trusting eyes, as if to say, "This is what I wanted to show you. This is how we survive." Marcus sank down onto the floor, overwhelmed. He thought about the cold nights ahead, the constant hunger, the danger of the streets. Here was shelter, here was food, here was safety. But there was also the journal and the story of a man who'd tried to expose the truth and had apparently disappeared. Here was evidence of something that might still matter, something that could help people. Marcus looked at the dog. "What do I do?" The dog just wagged its tail slowly, content to have led Marcus to safety. For the first time in 3 months, Marcus allowed himself to think beyond the next day, beyond mere survival. This bunker was a gift, but also a responsibility. The man who'd written that journal, Robert Chen, had trusted that someone would find this place, would find the truth he'd hidden. Maybe Marcus was that someone. But first, they needed to survive, and this bunker gave them that chance. Marcus opened a can of beans with a dusty can opener he found in a drawer. He split the contents with the dog, both of them eating ravenously. The food was old but sealed and safe, and it was the best meal Marcus had eaten in months. As they ate together in the warm, safe bunker, Marcus made a decision. They would stay here. They would heal, both of them. And then, maybe, they would figure out what to do about Robert Chen's secret. The first week in the bunker passed in a blur of survival and cautious hope. Marcus established a routine that kept both him and the dog, whom he'd started calling Scout, alive and healing. Every morning, he'd climb the ladder to check the factory floor above, making sure no one had discovered their sanctuary. Then he'd return to tend to Scout's wounds, change bandages, and ration out their food carefully. The bunker's supplies were extensive, but not infinite. Marcus had counted everything: 247 cans of various foods, 60 military rations, 12 large water containers, each holding 5 gallons, medical supplies, batteries, blankets, and even some old books and magazines from the late 1980s and early 1990s. If he was careful, they could survive here for months. Scout was improving. The gash on his ribs was healing cleanly. Marcus had been religious about keeping it clean and changing the bandages using supplies from the bunker's surprisingly well-stocked medical kit. The leg was harder to assess. Scout could put a little weight on it now, which Marcus hoped meant it was a bad sprain rather than a break. The dog's spirit had certainly recovered. He followed Marcus everywhere in the bunker, his tail wagging whenever Marcus spoke to him. "Good boy," Marcus said, scratching behind Scout's ears as they sat together on one of the bunks. "You saved us, you know that? If you hadn't shown me this place—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The temperature outside had dropped into the teens at night. The news on the old radio, which still worked, powered by the bunker's backup generator that Marcus had figured out how to activate, reported that 3 homeless people had been found dead from exposure in the past week alone. That could have been him. Marcus turned his attention back to Robert Chen's journal, which he'd been reading in segments. The man had been meticulous, documenting everything. Chen had been a state environmental inspector, assigned to monitor industrial facilities in the Detroit area. In 1991, he'd been sent to investigate complaints about the Warren Chemical Plant, a facility that produced industrial solvents and cleaning agents. What he'd found there had clearly shaken him. The journal entries became increasingly alarmed as Chen documented his discoveries. Water samples showing toxic levels of trichloroethylene and benzene, falsified disposal records, secret nighttime dumping operations into storm drains that led directly to the Detroit River, and most damning of all, evidence that company executives knew about it and had been paying off local officials to look the other way. "These chemicals cause cancer," Chen had written in one entry, his handwriting shaky with emotion. "They're poisoning the water supply for thousands of families. Children are drinking this water, and the company knows. They know, and they don't care." Marcus set the journal down and moved to the eastern wall, where Chen had mentioned hiding evidence. The ventilation panel came off easily. Chen had loosened the screws deliberately. Behind it was a metal document box, military issue, sealed with tape that had long since dried and cracked. Inside were photocopies, dozens of them, lab reports, internal company memos, photographs of illegal dumping operations taken with what must have been a telephoto lens. Bank records showing payments to city officials. It was all here, meticulously documented and preserved. At the bottom of the box was a letter, handwritten on official state letterhead, "To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I've tried to do this the right way. I filed reports with my supervisors. I contacted the EPA. I even tried to reach out to journalists. But everyone I've talked to has either ignored me or actively worked to silence me. The Warren Chemical executives have powerful friends. They've made it clear that if I continue pursuing this, there will be consequences. I've received threats. My car was vandalized. Yesterday, someone followed me home. I'm scared, but I can't let this go. People are being hurt. Children are being poisoned. This bunker was built to protect people from nuclear war. But it turns out the real danger comes from our own greed and indifference. If I disappear, please take this evidence to someone who can help. The Detroit Free Press has an investigative team. The State Attorney General's office has an environmental crimes division. Someone, somewhere, has to care about the truth. Don't let them bury this like they're trying to bury me. Robert Chen, June 15th, 1992. Marcus's hands shook as he held the letter. He looked at Scout, who was watching him with those intelligent eyes. "He disappeared," Marcus said quietly. "That's why no one ever came back here. He documented all of this, hid it, and then something happened to him." Scout whined softly, pressing closer to Marcus's leg. Marcus spent the next 2 hours going through every document in the box. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, but it was also 33 years old. The Warren Chemical Plant. Marcus vaguely remembered seeing it. A massive facility near I-696. Was it even still operating? Were the same people still in charge? Did any of this even matter anymore? He pulled out the bunker's old radio and spent time scanning stations until he found a local news channel. The announcer was discussing traffic on the Lodge Freeway, then moved on to other stories. Marcus was about to give up when he heard it. Ongoing lawsuit against Warren Chemical Industries, with residents claiming that decades of illegal waste disposal has led to elevated cancer rates in the surrounding neighborhoods. The company denies all wrongdoing, and lawyers for WCI argue that there's no concrete evidence linking their operations to health problems. The case has been in the courts for 7 years with no resolution in sight. Marcus's breath caught. 7 years. People had been fighting this for 7 years, and the company was still denying everything, still hiding behind lawyers and technicalities. And here, in Marcus's hands, was the evidence that could prove it all. He looked around the bunker, his sanctuary, his salvation. This place had saved his life, but it also held the potential to save others, to finally bring justice for people who'd been poisoned, ignored, and silenced, just like Robert Chen had been. But taking this evidence public meant revealing the bunker. It meant exposing himself. It meant dealing with authorities, answering questions, going back into the system. It meant risking everything he'd found here. Scout limped over and laid his head on Marcus's knee, looking up at him with complete trust. "What do I do, boy?" Marcus whispered. Chen trusted that someone would find this and do the right thing. But doing the right thing might cost us everything. Scout's tail wagged slowly, as if to say, "You'll figure it out. We'll figure it out together." Marcus carefully returned all the documents to the metal box and sealed it. He wasn't ready to decide yet. First, they needed to be stronger. Scout needed to heal completely. Marcus needed to put on some weight, regain his strength. He needed to think this through carefully, consider all the angles. But as he lay in the bunk that night, Scout curled up beside him, Marcus couldn't stop thinking about Chen's letter, about the children drinking poisoned water, about the families fighting a legal battle they couldn't win because they didn't have the evidence. He had the evidence now. The question was, what would he do with it? Outside, the November wind howled through the abandoned factory. But down in the bunker, Marcus was warm and safe, wrestling with a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, he told himself. Tomorrow, he'd start figuring out a plan. Tonight, he'd just be grateful for survival. But somewhere in his heart, Marcus already knew what he was going to do. He'd been powerless for so long, ignored and dismissed by every system that was supposed to protect him. Now, he had power. The power to help others who were just as powerless as he'd been. He just needed to find the courage to use it. 3 weeks in the bunker had transformed both Marcus and Scout. The dog could now walk without limping. His ribs had healed completely, and he'd gained weight from regular meals. His coat, after several baths using the bunker's water recycling system, had turned out to be a rich reddish-brown. He was beautiful, Marcus realized, when not covered in blood and grime. Marcus had changed too. Regular food had filled out his hollow cheeks, and his ribs no longer protruded quite so sharply. He'd found clothes in the bunker's supply room, oversized military fatigues that he had to roll up and cinch with a belt, but they were warm and clean. For the first time in months, he didn't constantly feel like he was one bad day away from death. But comfort had brought clarity, and clarity had brought conviction. Marcus knew what he needed to do with Robert Chen's evidence. The question wasn't whether to act, but how. He'd spent days listening to the radio, gathering information. The lawsuit against Warren Chemical Industries was stuck in legal limbo. The company's lawyers had successfully argued that without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the case was based purely on circumstantial correlation between proximity to the plant and elevated cancer rates. The plaintiff's lawyers couldn't prove deliberate contamination, couldn't prove that the company knew about the danger, but Marcus could prove it. Chen's documents proved everything. The problem was how to get the evidence to people who could use it without exposing himself. At 14, without identification, without guardians, Marcus was a runaway in the eyes of the law. If he went to the police, they wouldn't focus on the documents. They'd focus on him. They'd call social services. They'd send him back into the system, probably back to the Hendersons, and this time they'd make sure he couldn't escape. He needed a different approach. Marcus had found an old Detroit phone book in the bunker from 1991, but it was a start. Using the bunker's landline phone, which incredibly still had a dial tone, he'd called information to get current numbers. After several attempts, he'd managed to reach the main desk at the Detroit Free Press. "I need to speak to someone in your investigative journalism department," Marcus had said, trying to make his voice sound older, more confident. "Regarding what story?" the receptionist asked, sounding bored. "The Warren Chemical lawsuit. I have evidence. Original documents from 1992. There was a pause. "Please, hold." Marcus had been transferred 3 times before finally reaching a reporter named Sarah Kowalski. Her voice was sharp, professional, skeptical. "Who am I speaking with?" she'd asked. "That doesn't matter right now," Marcus had said. "What matters is that I have documents proving Warren Chemical knowingly dumped toxic waste into the water supply for years. Lab reports, internal memos, photographs, everything." "How did you obtain these documents?" "They were hidden by a state environmental inspector named Robert Chen in 1992. "Have you heard of him?" Another pause. "Robert Chen disappeared in late 1992. The official conclusion was that he'd left the state, possibly fled to avoid personal debts. Are you telling me this is related to Warren Chemical?" "I'm telling you. He was scared for his life, and he hid evidence that could finally prove what that company did, evidence that could help the families in that lawsuit." "Where are these documents now?" Marcus had hesitated. "Safe. I need guarantees before I turn them over. I need to know they'll actually be used, that you won't just sit on them or let lawyers bury them again." "I can't make promises without seeing what you have," Kowalski had said. "But if what you're saying is true, this is exactly the kind of story we investigate. Where can we meet?" Marcus had ended the call without answering, his heart pounding. He needed to be smarter about this. Now, sitting in the bunker with Scout beside him, Marcus was formulating a plan. It was risky, maybe foolish, but it was the best he could come up with. He would make copies of everything. The bunker had an old photocopier in one of the side rooms. It took several tries and some creative wire splicing to get it working, but Marcus managed it. He spent an entire day copying every document in Chen's box, creating 3 complete sets. One set would go to Sarah Kowalski at the Free Press. One set would go to the State Attorney General's Environmental Crimes Division. And one set, the originals, would remain hidden in the bunker, insurance in case something went wrong. But how to deliver them without exposing himself? The answer came from an unexpected source: Scout. The dog had become increasingly restless, needing more exercise than the confines of the bunker could provide. Marcus had started taking him out in the early mornings, before sunrise, letting Scout run in the empty lots around the abandoned factory. The dog always stayed close, always came when called, as if he understood that Marcus was his person now, his pack. On one of these morning excursions, Marcus noticed a woman walking her own dog a few blocks away. A regular early morning walker, it seemed. She looked to be in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle way with her golden retriever. An idea formed. 2 days later, Marcus put his plan into action. He carefully packaged the copies of Chen's documents in 2 waterproof bags, along with typed letters explaining what they were and where they'd come from. He addressed one package to Sarah Kowalski at the Detroit Free Press, the other to the State Attorney General's office. Then, wearing his oversized jacket with the hood up, he waited near the route where he'd seen the woman walking her dog. When she appeared right on schedule, Marcus approached cautiously. Scout sat obediently beside him. They'd been practicing basic commands, using techniques Marcus had found in an old dog training manual in the bunker. "Excuse me," Marcus said, keeping his voice low, his face shadowed by the hood. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I need help." The woman stopped, her hand automatically going to her phone, a defensive gesture Marcus recognized. "It's not like that," Marcus said quickly. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just need these packages delivered, and I can't do it myself. It's important. People need this information." "Why can't you deliver them yourself?" the woman asked, suspicious but not hostile. Because I'm not supposed to exist, Marcus said simply. And if people know I exist, they'll make me disappear, just like they made the person who collected this evidence disappear. He held out the packages. Please, these documents prove that Warren Chemical poisoned people's water. There are families fighting a lawsuit right now who need this evidence. I'm not asking you to get involved beyond dropping these off. Just please help. The woman looked at him for a long moment, then at Scout, who sat perfectly still, his tail wagging slightly. That's a good dog, she said finally. He is, Marcus agreed. He saved my life, and now I'm trying to save someone else's. The woman reached out and took the packages, examining the addresses. Warren Chemical, she said slowly. I know people in the neighborhoods near that plant. Good people. Sick people. Then you know why this matters, she nodded. I'll deliver these today. But son, she paused, studying what little she could see of his face. You should get help. Whatever you're running from can't be worse than what I'd be running back to, Marcus interrupted. Thank you for this. You're doing something really important. Before she could respond, Marcus turned and walked away quickly, Scout trotting beside him. He didn't look back. The story broke 4 days later. Marcus heard it first on the radio, his hand freezing midway through opening a can of soup. Sarah Kowalski's voice, being interviewed on the morning news. These documents are explosive. They prove that Warren Chemical Industries knew they were dumping toxic waste into the water supply and actively worked to cover it up. We have internal memos discussing how to hide the contamination, lab reports showing dangerous levels of carcinogens, even photographs of illegal dumping operations. This is exactly the evidence that the plaintiffs in the lawsuit have been searching for. The news anchor's voice cut in. How did you obtain these documents? They were delivered to our office anonymously, along with a letter explaining they'd been hidden by Robert Chen, a state environmental inspector who disappeared in 1992. We've confirmed Chen's employment records and his assignment to investigate Warren Chemical. The timing of his disappearance coincides with when he would have been compiling this evidence. What does Warren Chemical say about this? They've declined to comment pending their lawyer's review of the documents, but I can tell you that within hours of our publication, the State Attorney General's office announced they're opening a criminal investigation. Marcus sat back, his heart pounding. It was real. It was actually happening. Chen's evidence was finally going to be used. Scout nudged his hand, sensing his agitation. Marcus scratched the dog's ears absently, listening as the news report continued. The question everyone's asking is, who had these documents, and why did they wait until now to come forward? That question haunted the news cycle for the next week. Marcus followed every update on the radio, listening as the story grew bigger and bigger. The lawsuit against Warren Chemical was revived with new energy, bolstered by Chen's evidence. Environmental groups held press conferences. Former employees came forward with their own stories of contamination and cover-ups. The company's stock price plummeted, but there was also another development, one that made Marcus's blood run cold. Warren Chemical Industries has posted a $50,000 reward for information leading to the identification of the person who possessed Robert Chen's documents, the news anchor reported. Company lawyers are arguing that the documents may have been stolen, and they want to question this individual about how they obtained sealed evidence from an official investigation. Marcus's hands shook. $50,000. That was enough money to make people remember things, notice things, report things. The woman he'd given the packages to, would she come forward? She'd seen his face, sort of. She could describe him, describe Scout. And while she'd seemed kind, $50,000 was a lot of money. For the first time since finding the bunker, Marcus felt truly afraid. He was careful about his excursions to the surface now, only going out in the darkest hours before dawn, always watching for anyone who might be watching back. Scout seemed to sense his anxiety, staying closer than usual, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds. 2 weeks after the story broke, Marcus was returning from a supply run to a dumpster behind a grocery store when he saw them. Two men in dark suits, standing near the entrance to the Riverside Industrial Complex. They weren't security guards. Their posture was wrong, too alert, too focused. One of them was holding what looked like a photograph, showing it to a homeless man Marcus recognized from the area. Marcus's stomach dropped. He pulled Scout behind a wall and watched. The homeless man was shaking his head, but one of the suited men pulled out a wallet, showing him something, money most likely. The homeless man suddenly became more animated, pointing toward the old factory where Marcus's bunker was hidden. They knew, maybe not exactly where he was, but they knew enough. Marcus didn't go back to the bunker that night. Instead, he and Scout walked, putting distance between themselves and the factory. They spent the night in an old church doorway in Midtown, Marcus barely sleeping, Scout pressed against him protectively. By morning, Marcus had made a decision. The bunker had been a sanctuary, but it was compromised now. He couldn't risk leading anyone back to it, especially not people who might be connected to Warren Chemical. But more than that, he realized something important. He'd done what Chen had asked. The evidence was out there. Justice was being pursued. His part in this was finished. What he needed now wasn't hiding. What he needed was a permanent solution. That afternoon, Marcus did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He walked into a police station. The Detroit Police Department's 5th Precinct was busy, full of people dealing with various crises. Marcus stood in line with Scout beside him, his heart hammering. A dozen times he almost turned and ran, but Scout leaned against his leg, solid and trusting, and Marcus held his ground. When it was finally his turn, Marcus approached the desk sergeant, a heavy-set black woman with tired eyes and a nameplate that read, Sergeant Williams. "I need to report myself as a runaway," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sergeant Williams looked up from her computer, studying him. Her expression softened when she saw Scout. "How old are you, son?" 14. "My name is Marcus Hayes. I ran away from a foster home in Warren 3 months ago." The sergeant typed something into her computer, frowning. "Marcus Hayes. Yes, there's a report. Your foster parents, the Hendersons, filed a missing persons report." "They hurt me," Marcus said simply. "That's why I ran." Something changed in the sergeant's expression. "Sit down. Let me make some calls." What happened next was a blur of interviews, statements, and worried faces. A different social worker, not Ms. Patterson, arrived, a younger woman named Lisa Rodriguez, who listened without judgment as Marcus described the abuse at the Hendersons' home. A police detective took detailed notes, asking careful questions about specific incidents, dates, injuries. "Why didn't you report this when it was happening?" Rodriguez asked gently. "Because nobody ever believes kids like me," Marcus said. "We're in the system because nobody wants us. When we complain, we're just being difficult." Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away. "I believe you, Marcus, and we're going to make sure you're safe." They asked where he'd been staying. Marcus hesitated, then made a decision. "I was surviving on the streets, mostly. I found some abandoned buildings for shelter. Then, about 3 weeks ago, I found a bunker, an old Cold War bunker under the Riverside Industrial Complex. That's where I've been." The detective's eyes widened. "A bunker, can you show us where?" Marcus nodded slowly. "But there's something you need to know. That bunker, it's where I found the documents, the Robert Chen documents that were in the news." The room went very quiet. "You're the one who delivered those documents?" Rodriguez asked, her voice a mix of shock and something else. Respect, maybe. Chen left them there. He knew he was in danger and he wanted someone to find them. "I found them, and I made sure they got to people who could help." The media storm that followed Marcus's revelation was unlike anything he could have imagined. Within hours of the police confirming that a 14-year-old runaway had discovered and delivered the Warren Chemical documents, news vans surrounded the 5th Precinct. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Marcus watched from a conference room window, feeling simultaneously exposed and strangely vindicated. "Don't worry," Detective James Morrison said, a stocky man in his 40s with kind eyes. We're not releasing your name to the press. You're a minor, and given the circumstances, you're protected." Lisa Rodriguez sat beside Marcus, her hand resting protectively on Scout's head. The social worker had allowed the dog to stay with Marcus during questioning, recognizing that separating them would only cause more trauma. "What happens now?" Marcus asked quietly. "Now we investigate your claims about the Hendersons," Morrison said. "We've already contacted Child Protective Services. There will be a formal inquiry into the abuse allegations. In the meantime, you won't be going back there." "Where will I go?" The question came out small, frightened. Marcus hated how young he sounded. Rodriguez smiled gently. "I have some ideas, but first, let's deal with one thing at a time. Marcus, what you did, delivering those documents, that took incredible courage. You could have just kept surviving in that bunker, kept your head down, but you chose to help others." "Chen asked for help," Marcus said simply. "He left that letter asking someone to do the right thing. I couldn't ignore that." Over the next 3 days, Marcus told his story again and again, to police, to social workers, to investigators from the State Attorney General's office. He led them to the bunker, watching as they descended into the space that had saved his life. They documented everything: the supplies, the communications equipment, Chen's journal, the ventilation duct where the documents had been hidden. A young assistant district attorney named David Park examined the bunker with obvious excitement. "This is incredible. A perfectly preserved Cold War-era civilian defense bunker. I didn't even know these existed in Detroit." "There are probably others," Morrison said. "Built during the height of nuclear paranoia, then forgotten when the Cold War ended. But what captured the most attention was Chen's journal and the remaining documentation in the bunker. Forensics experts confirmed that the handwriting matched samples from Robert Chen's employment file. The dates corresponded with his investigation of Warren Chemical. Everything Marcus had said checked out. The Warren Chemical story continued to dominate local news. 3 company executives had been arrested on charges of environmental crimes and conspiracy to commit fraud. The CEO had resigned. The lawsuit had been settled for $47 million, distributed among more than 300 families affected by the contamination. And at the center of it all, though his name was protected, was a homeless teenage boy and the dog who had led him to the truth. "There's something else," Rodriguez said during one of their meetings at Child Protective Services. "The woman who delivered your packages to the newspaper and the Attorney General's office, she came forward after she saw the news about a teenager being involved. She wants to meet you." Marcus's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won out. Her name was Margaret Wilson, and she was 53 years old, a retired schoolteacher who lived in the Jefferson Chalmers neighborhood. She arrived at the CPS office with her golden retriever, Max, and the moment she saw Marcus, her eyes filled with tears. "I knew something was wrong," she said, sitting across from him in the small conference room. "The way you approached me that morning, you looked so scared, so desperate. And then when the story broke about the documents, I thought about you every day. I prayed you were okay." "You didn't tell anyone about me," Marcus said, "even with the reward." Margaret looked offended. "That reward was blood money, offered by people trying to intimidate a brave young man into silence. I would never." She paused, studying him. "Where are you staying now?" "A temporary foster placement," Marcus said, "just until they figure out something more permanent." What he didn't say was that the temporary home was cold, crowded, and barely better than the streets. The foster mother, Mrs. Jackson, meant well, but had 6 other kids and seemed overwhelmed by everything. Scout was staying at a shelter. They wouldn't allow dogs in the foster home, and Marcus missed him desperately. Margaret seemed to sense this. "How would you feel about staying with me? Temporarily, of course, until something permanent is arranged. I have a large house, just me and Max, and I've already been approved as an emergency foster placement. I fostered children before I retired from teaching." Marcus stared at her. "Why would you do that?" "Because you remind me of my son," Margaret said softly. "David. He died 12 years ago. Cancer, from contaminated water in our old neighborhood near Warren Chemical. He was only 19. Her voice broke slightly. When you gave me those packages, when you told me people needed that information, you were trying to save people like David. How could I not help you after that? Rodriguez was already nodding. If you're comfortable with it, Marcus, I can arrange the placement today. It would be temporary, but it would give us time to find the right permanent situation. Marcus looked at Margaret, really looked at her. He saw genuine kindness in her eyes, but also grief and understanding. She knew what it meant to lose something precious. She knew what it meant to fight for justice. "Can Scout come?" Marcus asked. Margaret smiled. Of course. Max could use a friend. By evening, Marcus found himself in Margaret's home in Jefferson Chalmers, a cozy 3-bedroom house with a fenced backyard and warm lighting that made everything feel safe. Scout bounded through the rooms, his tail wagging as he explored, while Max followed patiently, accepting this new energetic companion with good-natured tolerance. Margaret showed Marcus to a bedroom that had clearly once belonged to her son. There were faded posters on the walls, bands Marcus didn't recognize, a Detroit Pistons pennant, photographs of a smiling young man at various ages. "I haven't changed much since David passed," Margaret said quietly, "but I think he'd like knowing someone else was using his room, especially someone who's fighting the same fight he never got to finish." That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in months, with Scout curled up beside him and moonlight streaming through clean windows, Marcus allowed himself to feel something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning, Marcus woke to the smell of pancakes. He found Margaret in the kitchen cooking breakfast while listening to the news on a small radio. State Attorney General announced today that the Warren chemical investigation has expanded to include the disappearance of Environmental Inspector Robert Chen in 1992. New evidence suggests Chen's disappearance may not have been voluntary. Margaret turned off the radio and smiled at Marcus. Hungry. They ate together, Marcus, Margaret, and the 2 dogs lying hopefully beneath the table. It felt surreal, domestic, normal, safe. Things Marcus had almost forgotten could exist. "I have a question," Margaret said as they finished eating. "What do you want to do now? I mean long term. School, obviously, but beyond that. You've been surviving day to day for so long. Have you thought about what you want from life?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I want to help people," he said finally. "Like Chen tried to do. Like you did by delivering those packages. I want to be someone who stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "Then we'll make sure you get the chance to do that. Education, support, whatever you need. David wanted to be an environmental lawyer before he got sick. Maybe you could—" She stopped, shaking her head. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't project my son's dreams onto you." "No," Marcus said firmly. "That sounds right. That sounds like something worth working toward." Scout barked softly as if agreeing, and they all laughed. Outside, Detroit was waking up to another cold November day. But inside Margaret's house, something was beginning that felt like a new chapter. Not just survival, but actual life. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the hallway of Southeastern High School, his backpack slung over one shoulder, trying to blend in with the stream of students moving between classes. It should have been terrifying. He'd barely attended school in the past 2 years, moving from foster home to foster home, missing weeks and sometimes months at a time. But Margaret had enrolled him in February, working with school counselors to create a catch-up plan. And slowly, Marcus was finding his footing. "Marcus, wait up!" He turned to see Aisha Williams jogging toward him, her braids bouncing. She was in his English class, one of the first students who'd talk to him without treating him like he was fragile or broken. "You coming to the environmental club meeting after school?" she asked. "We're planning the presentation for the city council about the water testing initiative." Marcus nodded. "Yeah, I'll be there. Margaret's picking me up at 4:30. It still felt strange to say that, to have someone who would pick him up, who cared where he was, who asked about his day. But Margaret had been nothing but patient and kind, slowly helping Marcus understand what stability felt like. The environmental club had been Margaret's suggestion. "You care about these issues," she'd said, "and you have a unique perspective. Other students could learn from you." She'd been right. Once Marcus started talking about what he'd discovered in the bunker, about Chen's documentation and the real-world impact of environmental crimes, other students became engaged. The club had grown from 8 members to 27. They'd started a water testing program in older neighborhoods, partnering with Wayne State University's Environmental Science Department. Small steps, but meaningful ones. The day passed in its now familiar rhythm. Classes, lunch, more classes. Marcus was still catching up in math, but he was ahead in English and history. His teachers seemed genuinely invested in his success, especially once they understood his circumstances. Not that everyone knew his full story. The school administration kept the details private, but word had spread that he was the kid who'd discovered the Warren chemical documents. Some students treated him like a hero. Others kept their distance, unsure how to interact with someone who'd lived on the streets. Marcus was okay with both reactions. He'd learned that survival meant accepting help when it was offered and not expecting it from those who couldn't give it. After the environmental club meeting, Marcus walked out to the school parking lot where Margaret's silver Honda waited. As he approached, he saw Scout's face pressed against the back window, tail wagging frantically. "Someone missed you," Margaret said with a smile as Marcus climbed in. Scout immediately pushed his head over the seat, licking Marcus's face enthusiastically. "Hey, boy," Marcus laughed, scratching behind the dog's ears. "I was only gone for 8 hours." "He doesn't understand time the way we do," Margaret said, pulling out of the parking lot. "To him, you're gone forever every time you leave." They drove through Detroit's streets, the city looking different than it had 6 months ago. Marcus could see it now as more than just a survival landscape. He saw the beauty in the old architecture, the resilience in the neighborhoods rebuilding themselves, the hope in new businesses opening their doors. "I got a call from Lisa Rodriguez today," Margaret said as they drove. "The investigation into the Hendersons is complete. They're being charged with child endangerment and abuse. 3 other former foster children have come forward with similar allegations." Marcus was quiet, processing this. Part of him felt vindicated. His truth had been believed, his suffering acknowledged. But another part just felt sad that it had taken so long, that other kids had been hurt too. "There's more," Margaret continued gently. "The charges against Warren Chemical executives include obstruction of justice in Robert Chen's disappearance. They found evidence that company security followed Chen, documented his movements, and may have been involved in threatening him. The theory is that Chen went into hiding, possibly fled the country after the threats escalated." "So he might still be alive?" Marcus asked. "It's possible. The FBI has reopened the case as a missing person investigation rather than a voluntary disappearance. If he's out there, they're going to try to find him." When they arrived home, Marcus helped prepare dinner, a routine they'd established early on. Cooking together gave them time to talk without the pressure of sitting across from each other in formal conversation. Tonight, Margaret was teaching him how to make her mother's recipe for chicken and dumplings. "I've been thinking," Margaret said as she stirred the pot, "about permanency. Your case review is coming up next month." Marcus's hands stilled on the dumpling dough he was rolling. Case reviews determined placement changes, permanent arrangements. He'd been through enough of them to know they rarely ended well. "I want to file for permanent guardianship," Margaret said quietly, "if that's something you'd be comfortable with. No pressure. I know we've only been together for 6 months. But Marcus, you've become part of my life in a way I didn't expect. This house feels like a home again, and I hope, you feel safe here." Marcus's vision blurred with tears. He'd promised himself he wouldn't cry anymore, that he'd be strong. But this wasn't weakness. This was relief, pure and overwhelming. "I'd like that," he managed to say. "I'd really like that." Margaret came around the counter and pulled him into a hug. Scout, sensing the emotional moment, pushed between them, wanting to be part of it. Later that evening, after dinner, Marcus sat on the back porch with Scout beside him. The May air was warm, carrying the smell of flowers from Margaret's garden. He pulled out his phone, a real phone now with actual service, and opened the Notes app where he'd been writing. It had started as a way to process everything that had happened, but it had evolved into something more, a record, a testimony, a message to anyone else who might need it. He typed, "6 months ago, I was homeless, hungry, and convinced that no one cared whether I lived or died. Then I found a wounded dog, and that dog led me to a bunker. But the bunker wasn't the miracle. It was just a building. The miracle was remembering that I mattered, that my choices could make a difference, that standing up for what's right is worth the risk." Robert Chen tried to do the right thing and paid a terrible price. But his truth survived. It waited 33 years in the dark, and then it changed everything. If you're reading this and you're scared, if you're alone, if you think no one will listen, don't give up. Your truth matters. Your voice matters. Sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to speak, and everything can change. I'm still figuring out who I am and who I want to be, but I know this. I want to be someone who helps others find their voice. Someone who stands up even when it's scary. Someone who remembers what it felt like to be invisible and makes sure no one else has to feel that way. Scout and I are safe now. We have a home. We have someone who cares. And every day I try to honor Robert Chen's courage by being a little bit braver myself. The bunker saved my life, but the choice to help others, that's what gave my life meaning. Marcus saved the note and looked at Scout, who was gazing up at him with those intelligent, trusting eyes that had started this whole journey. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Marcus whispered. Scout's tail thumped against the porch deck. Inside, Marcus could hear Margaret humming as she cleaned up the kitchen. The sound was domestic, peaceful, safe. Through the window, he could see her pause to look at a photograph of David, touching it gently before continuing her work. Marcus understood now that healing wasn't about forgetting the pain or pretending the hard times never happened. It was about finding meaning in the struggle, building something good from the broken pieces, and having the courage to trust again even after trust had been shattered. Tomorrow, he'd go to school. He'd work on his algebra homework with the tutor Margaret had hired. He'd attend the environmental club meeting and help plan their water testing initiative. He'd come home to a real house with real food and a real family, however unconventional that family might be. But tonight, he just sat on the porch with his dog, grateful to be alive, grateful to matter, grateful for second chances and wounded dogs and forgotten bunkers that held more than just supplies. They held hope. The Detroit skyline glowed in the distance, and Marcus smiled. He was home. If you've made it this far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories. Leave us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating content like this. Thank you for being here with us.